Welcome to Get Your Books Out, and thank you for joining us. Bringing you the best books you may have never heard of from the world of land, sea and air. Gripping adventure stories and tales of military daring-do, tomfoolery, incompetence and genius. If you like our channel, please share, like and subscribe. Chapter 6. Court of Inquiry. Dewar's letter to Vice Admiral John Kelly was even longer than his commander's report to him. It stretched to almost 4 pages and contained 23 neatly numbered paragraphs. It was also more restrained. Dated 8th of March, it opened. Sir, I have the honour to submit the following letter in accordance with the procedure laid down in King's Regulations and Admiralty Instructions, Article 9. I am extremely loath to make a complaint against my superior officer, Rear Admiral St. George Collard, CBDSO, but I have no alternative as his behaviour is calculated to undermine not only my own position but the general discipline of the ship which I have the honour to command. After careful consideration, I have decided that this is the only course open to me, and the incidents complained of are therefore described below. Out of the remaining 22 paragraphs, the first half, exactly 11 of them, dealt with the ship's dance and what Collard had called Bandmaster Barnacle. Dewar ended by dealing with the incident on the 6th of March. On the following afternoon, the Rear Admiral returned to the ship at 17:45. The watch was fallen in on the quarterdeck, ready to work the derrick and hoist in the barge. Entirely ignoring the commander, Duty Lieutenant Commander, and the officer of the watch, who were stationed there to receive him, he shouted for men to get down the ladder, attend to boat ropes, etc. After completing the disembarkation of his gear, he ordered the barge ashore and walked past me without returning my salute. His general attitude and demeanour had every appearance of a studied insult to me in the presence of a large number of officers and men. When his secretary, Lieutenant Commander Crichton, returned to him with a typed copy now bearing a large "Secret" stamp at its head, Dewar read it and pondered over the subscription on the first page. This read, "The Vice Admiral commanding 1st Battle Squadron," and underneath, "Copy to Rear Admiral." He altered that last line to "through Rear Admiral" and initialed the change. This cannot have been a casual afterthought. Dewar was not that sort of man. He had a rational and methodical mind and was not given to sudden whims. What that alteration meant was that instead of Collard simply reading and noting both Dewar's and Daniel's letters, he would also have to take them personally to his own superior, a clear case of twisting the knife. Both letters were signed by their authors on the forenoon of Friday, 9th March, the day before the combined exercises with the Home Fleet were to begin. They were put into a large buff envelope marked "Complaints for the Vice Admiral." The envelope was sealed, and at about 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dewar, his cap tucked smartly under his arm, stepped into the day cabin where Collard was attending to some paperwork, helped by his secretary. He placed the envelope on the Admiral's desk and left. Hardly a word was exchanged. Dewar gone, Collard read both letters. It took some time and then more time for thought. He must have been acutely aware that if the complaints reached Vice Admiral John Kelly, then action would have to be taken. Action from which he, particularly as the newest and most junior flag officer in the Royal Navy, could not possibly escape unscathed. Fellow officers wondered for long afterwards why Collard had not pressed that bell on his desk and smartly requested the attendance of Dewar and Daniel. Surely, even at that late date, a long and private talk with his subordinates, a pledge of better understanding from the 3 men, perhaps some sort of apology all round, and the air would have been cleared and those letters torn up. Collard did nothing of the sort. Instead, he speculated with his secretary as to the chances of catching Vice Admiral Kelly that afternoon, then changed his mind and decided to leave things until the morning. So, at 9:15 on Saturday morning, while Royal Oak and every other ship in crowded Grand Harbour was abustle with all the activity of preparing for sea and the annual spring exercises for which they had been so long in training, while lighters were still alongside and ammunition and stores were still coming on board, Rear Admiral Collard was piped over the side and into his barge, which headed straight for Kelly's own flagship, HMS Warship. The sight of the stocky, sharp-nosed figure of his subordinate at that moment was obviously a vision Vice Admiral Kelly could have cheerfully foregone. The weight of command was heavy when there were only 7 hours of preparation left before his battle squadron of great ships left harbour and headed for sea. Still, he took Collard into his day cabin, read the letters, and then talked for the best part of an hour. It was later alleged that Collard spent most of his time not so much defending his own actions, but vilifying his subordinate officers for their lack of loyalty and support. Collard always angrily denied this, but even if he had, it would have served him little good. If it was in his mind or the minds of Dewar and Daniel, as it most probably was, that John Kelly would simply shrug his shoulders and suggest that, as time was pressing and the 3 of them were clearly not getting on together, then the simple answer would be for Collard to shift his flag into another vessel of the 1st Battle Squadron, then it was a great mistake. Kelly was not only a staunch ally of the Commander-in-Chief, but he also knew his master well. Keyes ruled the Mediterranean fleet. He ruled it and ran it. Nothing was too small or insignificant for his attention. Certainly not a roaring quarrel between 3 senior officers. Keyes would have to be told. Kelly called for his own barge and at 10:30 a.m. was boarding HMS Queen Elizabeth, the Commander-in-Chief's flagship. As Kelly had suspected, Sir Roger Keyes was outraged. Already the spring exercises had been cut short because the Atlantic Fleet had to return home to England at the behest of King George V himself, in time to be reviewed by, of all people, a Prince of Afghanistan. This had displeased him greatly. And now these letters. He remembered asking Kelly to find out whether relations between Collard and his flag captain were strained. That was only a few weeks before, when Collard was acting as director of the War Games Room. As the Rear Admiral and the Commander-in-Chief shared very much the same ideas as to how a war at sea should be conducted, that is, as it always had been, Collard stood high in his regard. And Keyes recalled how, at that very war game, Dewar had seized the opportunity to expound his theory of tactics, which many of his seniors considered an attempt to teach them to suck eggs. To prove his point, Dewar had cited British naval actions in the late war. Keyes had been highly offended. As one of the most senior officers in that war, it was not only implied criticism of himself, but also of his fellow flag officers, especially his great friend and sponsor, Admiral of the Fleet Earl Beatty. And to make such remarks in front of junior officers who were present in the games room, it had all been most deplorable. Keyes also remembered how angry and resentful Dewar had looked when Collard had closed the exercise and shut up his flag captain. Whatever decision the CNC reached over this latest development, and there is no doubt at all that he would feel in all honesty that it would be for the good of the service, it was equally plain where his sympathies stood. But now, caged in his cabin aboard Queen Elizabeth, Keyes was in a quandary. It was obvious the 3 men could not stay together in the same ship, just as it was equally obvious that there would have to be a prompt investigation. There was far too much talk about weakening discipline in those letters for his liking. There was nothing for it. A court of inquiry would have to be held, and smartly. This meant that the combined fleet exercises would have to be held back. But if they were not to be ruined, sailing could not possibly be delayed beyond 6 o'clock on Monday morning. So he ruled that the court should sit in under 3 hours' time, at 1:30 that Saturday afternoon. He ordered that the board was to consist of Kelly, himself, and Rear Admirals W.H.D. Boyle and the Honourable H. Meade of the 1st and 3rd Cruiser Squadrons. To avoid unnecessary speculation, the inquiry would be held at the Castile, a tall, half-shuttered building, once a hostel cum barracks cum church of the Knights of Malta, and more recently a place of naval staff meetings. If the court were held, in the usual fashion, aboard ship, it would attract far too much attention. It was obvious from the start what Keyes expected the verdict to be. In his own strongly worded opinion, he had already decided that both Dewar's and Daniel's letters were utterly improper. As for putting him in such a situation just before the fleet sailed, it was altogether unpardonable. Before Kelly left to set about assembling the inquiry, Keyes, in a most ominous voice, asked him to find out at the inquiry whether Dewar had consulted or sought the advice of any senior officer before taking a step that was bound to have serious consequences. It was somewhere between 12:30 and 1:15 on Saturday afternoon when Dewar and Daniel were first told that they were to face a court of inquiry within 2 hours. The hand-delivered memorandum to Dewar read, "With reference to your letter of 8th March 1928, I have directed Vice Admiral J.D. Kelly, C.B., Rear Admiral W.H.D. Boyle, C.B., Rear Admiral the Honourable H. Meade, C.B., CVO, DSO, to assemble as a court of inquiry at 13:30 this afternoon, Saturday, to investigate the circumstances disclosed in your letter and to inquire into the general relations existing between the Rear Admiral, 1st Battle Squadron, and his flag captain and chief staff officer. You are to take all reasonable steps to hold available officers whose evidence may be required." The memorandum was signed by Keyes himself. If anyone can ever accuse a Royal Naval warship of being in a state of pandemonium, then there was pandemonium aboard Royal Oak. Dewar's first reaction was to order Daniel to stop all officers' shore leave as he considered every possible witness important. Bandmaster Barnacle was to be commanded to stand by too, and any other of the lower deck ratings Daniel felt might make helpful witnesses. Daniel hurried down to the wardroom and found several officers having their midday meal. He asked them to finish at the latest by 1:05, then he gave orders for all the waiters to clear away the dishes and be out of place by 10 past. Leaving a startled and wondering wardroom behind, he rushed off in search for more witnesses. He was back in the wardroom on the dot of 1:10, only to find that the waiters had not done as he had ordered. He blasted the Royal Marine Corporal in charge as only the commander of a battleship can. 5 minutes later, there was not a dish nor a waiter in sight. Only then did he tell the exceedingly curious members of the wardroom that there was to be a court of inquiry. He was just explaining to them that every officer who could give evidence would be required, and asking who had already gone ashore when Dewar sent for him. Dewar wanted a list of the names of any officers who could bear out the contents of his letter. In order to obtain them, he handed over to Daniel a copy of his letter to Vice Admiral Joe Kelly so that it could be read out. As it was marked secret, no one on board Royal Oak except the captain's secretary should have seen its contents before, and that included Daniel. Rushing back to the wardroom, Daniel started to read the letter aloud to the gathered officers. After each paragraph, he paused and made an impassioned plea for any officer who could support the allegations contained in it to have the guts to put his name forward. He was not even halfway through. Remember, it was a long letter of 23 paragraphs, when a messenger arrived. Dewar wanted to see him again. Daniel handed over the letter to Royal Oak's First Lieutenant, Lieutenant Commander George O'Donnell, to continue reading and raced off to see what his captain wanted this time. Dewar said he could wait no longer. He was taking the picket boat and going off to the Castile immediately. He would send the boat back for the officer witnesses, and they were to follow him at once. Once more, Daniel returned to the wardroom, this time to find that O'Donnell was still reading the captain's letter with a fair way to go. There was no more time. The rest would have to remain unread. Now, there was a heated debate better suited to a group of women who had been invited suddenly and unexpectedly to a party on the lawn at Buckingham Palace. What to wear? Nobody in that wardroom had attended a court of inquiry before. Was it full dress and swords or what? The harassed commander looked at the wardroom clock, cut short the argument, and told them to pile into the picket boat as they were, reefer jackets and all. Two very important potential witnesses were missing from the group. They were Commander Mulby Donald Brownlow, Navigation Commander of Royal Oak, and, being of greater seniority than Daniel, President of the Wardroom Mess, and the Reverend Harry Golding, the chaplain. They had already gone ashore. But somehow a message reached them, and they found their own way to the Castile. Brownlow was a particularly interesting individual. As third most senior officer aboard the flagship, he had considerable power and a great deal of influence if he wished to exercise it. He could have poured soothing oil on Royal Oak's troubled waters, especially as far as Daniel was concerned. Yet there is no evidence that he ever aired a view or gave a single word of advice. Among all the flagship's officers, from Collard down, he was perhaps the only one who felt, all along, that the situation would end in an inquiry. As for the rest of Royal Oak's potential witnesses, once they landed from the picket boat, they made their way as fast as they could to the Castile. Daniel even managed to get a lift in one of the island's few cars. All the same, they didn't manage to arrive until 1:45, 15 minutes late. Not a good way to appear at a court of inquiry in front of a Vice Admiral and 2 Rear Admirals. Bandmaster Barnacle was left to seek his own path to the Castile. The inquiry lasted for over 6 hours, but it did not take all that time for the court to discover that the relationship between Admiral and Flag Captain was beyond repair. Dewar was the first witness, but from time to time, as he was questioned, Collard was invited to comment on his evidence, and this soon led to high words. A great deal was made of the incident at the dance, and the fact that it had taken Dewar so long to drag the matter up again. This gave Kelly the opportunity to put the question that Roger Keyes had told him to ask. "Before going on with this," said Kelly, "would you tell me, Captain Dewar, whether you have ever sought the advice of any senior officer before taking the serious step of writing this letter which forms the subject of the inquiry?" Dewar answered, "I consider that my letter takes the form of reporting to my senior officer." Kelly scowled. 2 months after the event? While still pursuing Dewar as to the advisability of discussing affairs aboard Royal Oak with someone higher in rank, Kelly suddenly stopped and said, "I should like to ask Rear Admiral Collard, what have been the relations between you and your flag captain? Have you any reason to be dissatisfied with him?" Collard did not hold back. "I was not able to choose my flag captain. I was practically made to take Captain Dewar. I had a letter from the Naval Secretary asking me to take him and saying that if I did not, it would be very difficult to place him. I replied that I had no objection, but requested him not to tell Captain Dewar that I had not asked for him, and when the First Lord wrote saying that he proposed to appoint Captain Dewar as my flag captain, I did not object. I did not then know Captain Dewar, although I had met him once or twice. As regards personal relations between myself and my flag captain, they have been extremely difficult from the first day I joined. As regards personal relations between myself and my flag captain, they have been extremely difficult from the first day I joined. My flag captain has never tried to be in any way friendly with me. He has held himself aloof from me in every way, hardly ever spoken to me at meals. I have always, at the back of my mind, felt he was disloyal to me. It is a hard thing to prove, but I have always felt that my flag captain would never raise a finger to help me if I were in difficulties. He went on to cite the instance only 2 nights earlier, when Royal Oak and Remedies had been ordered to change berthing arrangements. Then Collard added, "That is an indication of our relations. I feel I have never had help from him, and he is utterly disloyal, and I have felt it, more or less at the back of my mind, that I must be careful of him. He has given me practically no assistance as Chief Staff Officer in the 4 months with me. Those, he ended, are our relations. Kelly might well have interposed at that moment and asked Collard why, when he himself had questioned him after the war games, had he expressed himself as perfectly content with his flag captain. Instead, Kelly said nothing. Dewar, in his turn, when asked if he wished to answer Collard's accusations, spared no words. I say that what the Rear Admiral has stated is definitely untrue. There is not a word of truth in it, except that I admit that since the incident on March the 5th up until now, I have not spoken to him. I dined once in his cabin and did not speak. On other occasions to say that I did not speak is untrue, and such statements have been made up. Dewar was pressed hard by the court, which really meant Kelly, for he was the main inquisitor. Question after question was asked about his loyalty to Collard, and then, on his view of the tone of Daniel's letter, the flag captain stuck to his guns and supported Daniel in every answer. Collard, although he had been sworn and cautioned, was not asked to give evidence formally. This is not surprising, since he and Dewar had been allowed what amounted to a double act ever since the court opened. Instead of Collard, an unexpected witness was called, Captain Cecil Osborne. He was on Key's staff and had served with Collard as his assistant at the Admiralty about 4 years ago. The first question put to him was about his relations with Collard. Good or bad? My relations were excellent. Could not have been better. I felt that my chief encouraged and supported me and that we understood one another. Would he describe Collard as a difficult man to get on with as a superior? No, I certainly would not. In the course of conversation with other captains on the Mediterranean station, had he heard that Collard was difficult? No, I have never heard the slightest breath of such a suggestion. That was the total of Captain Osborne's evidence. Daniel was called next, and he faced the same barrage as Dewar, especially over that phrase in the final paragraph of his letter, anticipation of vindictive fault-finding. He gave one startling answer towards the end of his evidence. The court asked him, without in any way trying to excuse the use of the word bugger, is it one which is used very seldom in Royal Oak? Daniel replied, yes, I do not remember ever hearing the word from officers. Anyone reading the official report of that court of inquiry would decide that it was simply a witch hunt and that Dewar and Daniel were the quarry. The truth is not so easy. The fact is that the court, even Kelly, who knew the Commander-in-Chief's mind and indignation, simply could not comprehend why they were sitting at all. Why had two senior officers like Dewar and Daniel gone to such lengths over a piffling incident? Why had two senior officers like Dewar and Daniel gone to such lengths over a few piffling incidents? And if they had taken such trifles to heart, why on earth had they not had a quiet word with a more senior officer and sought his advice? Instead, they had written letters that the Commander-in-Chief not only regarded as damnably opportune, but worse, had corrupted discipline by maligning their own Rear Admiral. The court was not so much hostile as incredulous. Daniel went, and the chaplain, Harry Golding, took his place. He was asked, there is a statement in this letter that there has been a great deal of discontent on the lower deck. Can you tell the court about it? Golding said he could, and proceeded to do so. At one stage, he said he had even heard the Admiral referred to as a bloody little swine by men using the smoking space just outside his cabin. After further questioning, he did confess that the men might have been talking about somebody else after all. Royal Oak's First Lieutenant, Lieutenant O'Donnell, came next. He was brief, confining his evidence to the fact that there was obvious indignation among the officers after the dance. They deeply resented the insult to the ship, the bandmaster, and themselves. Another witness, Lieutenant Commander Husband Clutton, disposed that while he had heard nothing of the goings-on during the dance, his partner had, and she was very upset. She said there had been an awful row and the bandmaster was to be sent home. The Admiral had used language which was very improper. Kelly, did the lady tell you what it was? Husband Clutton, no. Now it was Bandmaster Percy Barnacle's turn. Barnacle, with his ingrained sense of respect, found himself standing at attention before 3 admirals. However, his ordeal was soon over. He swore on oath that the Admiral had called him a bugger. Were you actually upset at the word bugger or at the fault-finding? With both. Which upset you the more? Being sworn at. Towards the end of the hearing, Collard's Flag Lieutenant, Burkhard, now newly promoted to Lieutenant Commander, testified. He could hardly have given his master a better reference. He said that relations between the Rear Admiral and Dewar were hardly cordial. The Admiral was always very friendly towards his flag captain, but Burkhard did not think that Dewar always responded. Relations were correct, but strained. Quite correct? Asked the court. Burkhard replied, I do not think that they should exist between Admiral and Chief Staff Officer. He went on to say that Collard and Dewar never shared the same bridge at sea, Dewar always went to the compass platform and that all communications were by voice pipe. He added that for a short while he had been flag lieutenant to the Commander-in-Chief and things were very different then. The rest of Royal Oak's officers who had attended the meeting in the wardroom that lunchtime, who had so precipitously rushed to the court and were now waiting at the back of the room to have their say, were never called. Just before 8 o'clock that evening, the court was cleared and the findings considered. At 9 o'clock, the 3 admirals comprising the court joined Sir Roger Keyes aboard Queen Elizabeth. They bore with them the findings already typed despite the desperate rush. They read, "The court is of the opinion that the Rear Admiral acted in an improper manner on the occasion of the first incident reported, and showed a lack of dignity and of a proper sense of his position. The second incident is considered to have been largely the result of the ill feeling that existed between the flag captain and the Rear Admiral. The Rear Admiral appears, certainly on occasions, to have been tactless and to have behaved in a manner any senior captain might take exception to. In these respects, the court considers that blame is attributable to Rear Admiral Collard. 2. On the other hand, the incidents would not in themselves account for the present state of affairs, and they appear to be made an excuse for the explosion of the resentment felt by Captain Dewar, which has long been working up. 3. The whole of this might have been avoided if Captain Dewar had, with the concurrence of otherwise of the Rear Admiral, represented his point of view to the Vice Admiral. 4. The relations between the Rear Admiral and his flag captain have obviously not been cordial from the outset. 5. The court is of the opinion that Captain Dewar's letter very much exaggerates the case. 6. The court feels also that Captain Dewar should never have accepted such a letter as that put in by Commander Daniel. 7. Although there is no direct evidence of collusion, there is some reason to suppose that Commander Daniel was in one mind with the flag captain, and that the strictures on the Rear Admiral were not entirely unwelcome to Captain Dewar. 8. The court considers that Captain Dewar is greatly to blame in the attitude he adopted after the first incident, as expressed in his own words. I therefore felt justified in taking no immediate official action, but it was necessary to reserve to myself the right of referring to this affair if, and only if, any regrettable recurrence should take place. With this consideration in mind, no question of personal apologies either to the Commander or myself was entertained. 9. The court is struck with the fact that Captain Dewar, in his evidence, approved the letter written by Commander Daniel, criticising the Rear Admiral, and is of the opinion that his, Captain Dewar's, ideas of discipline are detrimental to His Majesty's service. 10. Finally, the court finds that the tone and wording of Commander Daniel's letter purporting to give his reasons in writing for a definite incident are subversive and reprehensible to a degree. 10. Finally, the court finds that the tone and wording of Commander Daniel's letter purporting to give his reasons in writing for a definite incident are subversive and reprehensible to a degree. At breakfast time that Saturday morning, no one except Collard, Dewar, Daniel, and the officer who had typed them had ever seen those two letters, nor had anyone the vaguest idea what had been going on aboard Royal Oak. Now, less than 12 hours later, all 3 officers had been tried, examined, and a hasty verdict delivered, typing errors and all. It was a great tribute to naval efficiency. Aboard his own flagship, Keyes stood in his day cabin, looking out at the lights and the grim outline of the Mediterranean fleet, and considered the sentence.